She stepped onto the sprawling lawn wearing a simple sundress and worn sandals, her brown hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. The Collins family reunion was already in full swing, laughter and clinking glasses filling the summer air. Beneath the rented canopy, tables groaned under the weight of catered dishes, and a live band played cheerful tunes near the sprawling Collins estate. Margaret Collins, known simply as Maggie to those closest to her, walked unnoticed past clusters of relatives in designer clothes, their conversations dotted with names of exclusive resorts and high-end brands. A few cast glances in her direction, their eyes sliding over her modest dress and scuffed shoes, then dismissing her entirely. She was not important, or so they assumed. Maggie had grown used to the assumptions. It was almost amusing, except when it stung. A shrill laugh rang out from near the beverage table. Aunt Clarissa, in a bright floral dress, whispered to another cousin loud enough for Maggie to hear, "Honestly, did she not get the memo? It is a family reunion, not a farmer's market." Another round of snickers followed. Maggie smiled politely and continued toward the main tent. Near the entrance, a man in an expensive suit looked at her badge, which simply read, "Maggie Collins," and hesitated. "Family only past this point," he said with a practiced smile. Maggie nodded. "I am family." He looked doubtful but waved her through when her last name matched the guest list. Inside, the atmosphere changed only slightly. Here the air was thick with self-importance. Relatives clustered in self-congratulatory groups. Maggie caught bits of conversation, investment portfolios, private schools, art collections, none of it particularly interesting to her. She made her way to a small refreshment table, poured herself a glass of lemonade, and found an empty seat near the edge of the tent. No one joined her. That was fine. Maggie had not come for socializing. She had come because Alexander asked her to. Alexander Collins, her husband of 15 years, was running late due to a meeting with the board of the Collins Foundation, an organization they had built together from the ground up. The same foundation that had changed thousands of lives, though few in this crowd knew or cared. The Collins name was old money, dating back to the shipping tycoons of the 1800s, but modern wealth had diluted family ties into little more than networking opportunities. Those who remained close often did so out of mutual benefit rather than genuine affection. Maggie understood that. She did not fit into their polished world, and truthfully, she never wanted to. Across the lawn, a small commotion drew Maggie's attention. Clarissa, leading a group of similarly dressed women, was gesturing in her direction. Maggie recognized a few cousins, distant by both blood and affection, who regarded her with thinly veiled disdain. Clarissa approached, her smile tight and brittle. "Maggie, darling, you made it. We were just talking about your endeavors. How quaint they are." Maggie stood, setting her lemonade aside. "It is good to see you too, Aunt Clarissa." The older woman's eyes flickered over Maggie's dress with open disapproval. "Still doing that charity work, are you? How noble?" Before Maggie could respond, Clarissa continued, voice syrupy. "We were actually discussing the family's new investment club, a private group naturally. Invitation only." She smiled as if sharing a secret, then added pointedly, "Membership requires a certain liquidity." The implication hung in the air. Maggie, in her plain dress and non-existent designer handbag, clearly did not meet the unspoken criteria. Several of the surrounding women tittered behind manicured hands. Maggie's smile remained steady. "That sounds wonderful. I am sure you will all do very well." Clarissa's expression faltered, unused to being so effortlessly dismissed. "Well," she sniffed, "perhaps if you ever find yourself in a position to contribute, you might be considered." She turned, leading her little group away with the air of someone who had won a minor battle. Maggie reclaimed her seat, her hands steady as she lifted her lemonade again. It was not anger she felt, but something heavier. Pity, perhaps, for people who could not see past appearances to recognize real worth. Nearby, children played on the manicured lawn, their laughter a sweet counterpoint to the undercurrents of judgment among the adults. Maggie watched them, allowing herself a small, genuine smile. Time passed slowly. Speeches began under the tent, starting with Uncle Henry, who droned on about the importance of family heritage and preserving the Collins legacy. His words were full of pride and self-congratulation, mentioning charitable contributions as tax strategies and investments as marks of superiority. Not once did he acknowledge the foundation that bore the family name, yet operated entirely on the quiet diligence and heart of Maggie and Alexander. Eventually, Alexander arrived. He came not with fanfare, but with the quiet confidence that defined him. Tall, with salt and pepper hair and eyes that missed nothing, he wore a simple, well-cut suit that spoke of quality without ostentation. His gaze swept the crowd, landing on Maggie immediately. His face softened into a real smile, the kind she rarely saw directed at anyone else. Alexander made his way toward her, his path parting the crowd like a ship through water. Conversations paused. Heads turned. The weight of his presence was undeniable. When he reached Maggie, he bent and kissed her cheek gently. "Sorry to keep you waiting," he murmured. "Board meeting ran long." Maggie smiled up at him. "You are here now. That is what matters." Around them, whispers began to circulate. Clarissa, catching sight of Alexander, visibly paled. A few others exchanged uneasy glances. It was one thing to sneer at the plainly dressed woman sitting alone. It was another to realize she was married to the man who essentially controlled the Collins family's financial empire. Because Alexander was not just a wealthy relative, he was the largest shareholder in the family trust, the architect behind the modern success of the Collins name, and the quiet benefactor of several ventures that kept the family fortune growing. And Maggie, simple, unassuming Maggie, was his closest advisor, the co-creator of their charitable foundation, and the person whose counsel he valued above all others. The realization rippled through the tent like a shockwave. Those who had ignored or belittled Maggie now found themselves scrambling to reassess. Suddenly, her plain dress seemed less like a mark of inferiority and more like a deliberate choice, a testament to authenticity in a sea of pretension. Alexander turned to face the gathering, his arm casually draping around Maggie's shoulders in a gesture so natural and affectionate that it sent another ripple through the watching relatives. Aunt Clarissa, recovering quickly, bustled forward with a brittle smile. "Alexander, darling, so wonderful to see you. We were just discussing the new investment club. Perhaps you would be interested?" Alexander's smile was polite but distant. "Perhaps. Maggie and I usually manage our investments together." He looked deliberately at his wife, making it unmistakably clear that any decision involving their fortune would pass through her hands first. Clarissa's smile froze, the color draining slightly from her carefully powdered face. Maggie sipped her lemonade, her expression serene. A few other relatives sidled closer, suddenly eager to engage. Questions about the foundation and its upcoming projects surfaced, thinly veiled attempts to curry favor. Maggie answered kindly but without elaboration, offering no hints of the influence she quietly wielded. She had no interest in parading her accomplishments. Meanwhile, a staff member approached the main table with a microphone, tapping it to gather attention. "Ladies and gentlemen, if you would all please gather for the announcement regarding this year's family endowment recipients." The crowd shifted toward the stage area, some more eagerly than others. Every year, the Collins Foundation awarded grants to family members who presented business proposals, charitable initiatives, or educational pursuits deemed worthy of support. It was both a tradition and a strategic method to encourage innovation within the extended family. Maggie and Alexander had been instrumental in redesigning the selection process to focus on merit rather than connections, a change that had ruffled more than a few entitled feathers. Maggie and Alexander took seats near the front, an empty chair separating them from the rest of the family at Clarissa's insistence. The event organizer, a professional woman hired to maintain neutrality, stepped onto the stage. She greeted the family warmly, then launched into the list of grant recipients. Names were called, applause offered politely. A cousin's startup venture received a boost. An aunt's arts program secured funding. Smiles brightened, backs were patted, congratulations whispered. Then came the final announcement. And the recipient of this year's largest endowment for demonstrating exceptional impact and sustainability is... The organizer paused for effect. The Collins Foundation for Children's Education Initiative, championed by Margaret Collins. The tent fell into stunned silence. Maggie rose slowly, accepting the certificate with a calm smile. Cameras flashed, some relatives clapped awkwardly, others simply stared. Clarissa's expression was priceless, a mixture of confusion, horror, and begrudging recognition. Maggie thanked the organizer briefly, then returned to her seat beside Alexander. "You did not tell me they were awarding us this year," she murmured. Alexander smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "You earned it. I just made sure they could not overlook it." As the event concluded, a few brave souls approached Maggie to offer belated congratulations. She accepted their compliments graciously but without lingering. It was clear who was sincere and who merely sought proximity to power. By now, word had spread through the reunion like wildfire. Maggie was not just a quiet spouse with a penchant for charity work. She was an architect of the Collins family's modern success story, a woman who had built programs that changed lives and managed fortunes with wisdom and integrity. Underneath the canopy, conversations shifted tone. Suddenly, Maggie's modest appearance was reframed as authenticity, her simplicity admired rather than ridiculed. But Maggie remained unchanged, unaffected by the sudden recalibration of opinions. She had always known her worth did not depend on the approval of those who judged by appearances. The sun began to lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the lawn. Children chased each other with balloons, and the band struck up a soft tune for the evening's closing hours. Maggie found herself near the refreshment table again, savoring a rare moment of solitude. She was refilling her lemonade when Clarissa approached, her smile strained but determined. "Maggie," she began, voice syrupy, "I must admit I had no idea how involved you were with the Foundation's success. Truly remarkable." Maggie turned slowly, meeting Clarissa's gaze with polite patience. "Thank you, Aunt Clarissa." Clarissa pressed on, "We are organizing a gala next month to support the family museum. I would be honored if you and Alexander would attend as special guests. Perhaps even speak about your work." The invitation was not born of genuine respect, but of calculated opportunism. Maggie saw it clearly and felt no anger, only resignation. She considered for a moment, then said simply, "I will have to check my schedule." Clarissa's smile tightened, sensing the polite rebuff but unable to challenge it without losing further face. She murmured a few more pleasantries before retreating, her entourage quickly following. Maggie returned to her seat beside Alexander, who had observed the exchange with a hint of amusement. "Gracious as ever," he murmured. Maggie smiled, resting her head briefly against his shoulder. "It costs nothing to be kind, even when kindness is undeserved." Alexander chuckled softly. "That is what makes you the strongest person I know." Across the field, the catering staff began clearing dishes, folding chairs clattered as they were stacked, and the band packed away their instruments. The reunion wound down, leaving behind only the faint echoes of laughter and the lingering weight of lessons learned. As the last guest drifted away, Alexander and Maggie strolled toward their car, parked discreetly away from the main entrance. The evening air was cool, the scent of cut grass and distant honeysuckle filling the breeze. Hand in hand, they walked without hurry, content in the knowledge that true worth needed no announcement, no polished facade. It lived quietly in how one treated others, especially when no one was watching. As they drove away, Maggie glanced in the rearview mirror, watching the twinkling lights of the Collins estate recede into the distance. She felt no bitterness, no need for validation, only a deep, abiding peace that came from living authentically in a world obsessed with appearances. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to make a difference. But tonight, she was simply grateful to be herself, to be loved without condition, and to know that real power lay not in commanding attention but in commanding respect. And sometimes the greatest fortunes were the ones built not on wealth, but on character. The next morning brought a soft rain that tapped gently on the windows of the Collins residence, nestled on a quiet stretch of land just outside the city. Maggie stood in the kitchen, barefoot on the tiled floor, a mug of coffee warming her hands as she looked out over the misty garden. Birds chirped softly through the drizzle, and the hydrangeas near the path sagged under the weight of moisture. The calm was welcome. The family reunion had passed, leaving in its wake the usual flurry of follow-up emails, late-night reflections, and invitations that now carried a different tone. Overnight, Maggie had gone from the woman no one noticed to the woman everyone suddenly remembered. Alexander joined her, wrapping his arms gently around her waist from behind. "Good morning," he said softly against her ear. "Sleep well?" Maggie leaned into him, nodding. "Better than expected." He kissed the side of her head, then moved toward the coffee maker. "You were extraordinary yesterday. Not that you ever need to be, but you were." Maggie smiled faintly. "All I did was exist. That seemed to be enough of a shock." Alexander chuckled, pouring his own cup. "Sometimes the simplest truths are the hardest for people to grasp." Later that afternoon, they met with the Foundation's outreach coordinator, a sharp, empathetic woman named Elise who had worked with them for nearly a decade. The three of them sat in the Foundation's conference room, reviewing updates on current projects. Maggie listened intently as Elise explained a new literacy program they were piloting in underfunded rural schools. Charts and testimonials filled the screen, but Maggie's focus remained fixed on the photo of a young girl holding her first library card. "How soon can we scale this?" she asked, her voice steady. Elise smiled, already prepared. "With an additional investment of $50,000, we could expand to 5 more counties by the end of the year." Maggie looked to Alexander, who gave a small nod. "Done," she said simply. The decision took less than 30 seconds, but the impact would ripple for years. This was the power Maggie cared about, the ability to quietly shift the trajectory of lives without ever stepping onto a stage. That evening, while reviewing emails in her study, Maggie received a message from her cousin Laura. The subject line read, "An apology and a question." Curious, she opened it. Laura's note was brief but sincere. She admitted to having made assumptions at the reunion, confessed to following the lead of others who judged Maggie unfairly, and asked if they might meet for coffee to talk about a community development proposal she had been working on. Maggie read it twice, not out of disbelief, but to absorb the tone. It was not fawning. It was not calculating. It was honest. She replied warmly, suggesting a time the following week. The meeting with Laura was held at a small cafe near the Foundation office. Maggie arrived early, choosing a corner table with a view of the street. When Laura walked in, she looked nervous but determined. She ordered chamomile tea and settled in across from Maggie, clutching a well-worn folder. "Thank you for meeting me," Laura began. "I know I do not deserve it, but I appreciate the chance." Maggie nodded. "We all misjudge sometimes. What matters is whether we choose to grow from it." Laura exhaled slowly, then opened the folder. Inside were handwritten notes, diagrams, and a modest business plan for a job training center aimed at helping single mothers re-enter the workforce. As Laura explained her vision, Maggie listened with genuine interest. When the presentation ended, Maggie asked 2 questions, clear, specific ones that revealed she had both read the material and understood the stakes. Laura answered thoughtfully. Maggie closed the folder, folded her hands over it, and said, "You are on the right path. Let us work together to get this moving." Laura blinked, stunned. "Truly?" Maggie smiled. "Your idea has merit and your heart is in the right place. That is where it begins." In the weeks that followed, the reunion faded from memory for most of the Collins family, but for a few its lessons lingered. Maggie continued her work with the same quiet diligence as always, though now more of her extended family took notice. A few asked for meetings, a handful volunteered, 1 or 2 simply sent notes of thanks, having recognized in retrospect how poorly they had treated her. Maggie accepted all of it with calm grace. She was not interested in holding grudges. She was interested in building things that lasted. One afternoon, Alexander received a call from the chair of the Family Trust's advisory board. They were hoping Maggie would agree to speak at the next annual summit, not as a symbolic presence, but as the keynote. Alexander relayed the message over dinner, watching Maggie's expression shift from amusement to quiet disbelief. "They want me to speak?" she asked. "I think they finally realized who has been building the foundation they all lean on," he replied. Maggie considered, then said, "If I do it, it will not be about appearances or pleasing the room. I will tell the truth." Alexander smiled. "That is why they need to hear from you." She agreed. The keynote address, held 3 weeks later in a grand ballroom downtown, was attended by over 200 members of the extended Collins network. Many of them had never heard Maggie speak more than a sentence or two. On stage, under the soft glow of chandeliers, she stood without notes and began her speech with a story about a young boy from an underprivileged neighborhood who had recently graduated from college through the Foundation's scholarship program. She spoke about resilience, about the power of community, about how wealth without empathy was simply a dead weight. And finally, she spoke about the day she was humiliated at a family reunion for wearing a simple dress and not looking the part. The room fell completely silent. Appearances tell you nothing about a person's value, she said, and if we forget that, we lose not only our integrity, but our future. The applause that followed was not polite. It was sustained, heartfelt, and from a few, tearful. Maggie left the stage without fanfare, returning to her seat beside Alexander, who reached over and held her hand. That night, several family members approached her quietly, not to flatter, but to thank her. One admitted that the speech had caused him to rethink how he managed his own company's hiring practices. Another, a cousin she barely knew, said her words helped him understand why his teenage daughter had stopped attending their family events. Maggie listened, accepted each reflection with the same quiet attentiveness she gave to everyone, regardless of status. It was not about her. It was about what came next. The following month, Maggie found herself standing in a small community center on the edge of town, surrounded by folding chairs and half-painted walls. The job training initiative she had encouraged Laura to pursue was beginning to take shape. Volunteers were setting up tables, unloading donated laptops, arranging binders filled with resume templates and interview tips. Maggie moved among them quietly, offering encouragement where needed, asking about logistics, checking in with the coordinator. Laura arrived carrying a box of fresh flyers, her face flushed from the wind. "They are already asking about enrollment," she said breathlessly. "I think we are going to need more space sooner than expected." Maggie smiled. "That is a good problem to have." Together they stepped into the main room, which was still echoing slightly from the previous tenant's gospel choir rehearsal. Laura took a deep breath, then turned to Maggie with something like awe in her eyes. "I still do not understand why you gave me a chance." Maggie looked at her quiet for a moment. "Because someone gave me one, a long time ago, and because your idea was good. That is all it takes." She did not mention the reunion. She did not need to. It had already done its job. Elsewhere across the Collins family network, subtle changes had begun to unfold. A few members began to ask themselves how many other Maggies they had dismissed, not just in their family, but in their companies, their neighborhoods, their circles of influence. Some began to fund scholarships anonymously. Others looked for partnerships outside their usual social rings. A ripple had started, small but visible. None of this was Maggie's goal, but it was deeply satisfying to watch. At home, Alexander had noticed the shift too. At dinner one evening, he mentioned that the trust had quietly adopted her proposed equity guidelines without debate. They did not want to admit it, but your keynote rattled them in the best way, he said, pouring wine into their glasses. "It is about time," Maggie replied, setting down her fork. "We have had the power to open doors for decades. It is just that most people never noticed who was holding the key." Alexander smiled across the table. "You have always known." Later that night, as they walked together through the garden, Maggie paused beside the old stone bench where she often sat in the mornings. The sky above was dark, stars peeking through drifting clouds, and the faint scent of lavender lingered from a nearby bush. "Do you think they really changed?" she asked softly. Alexander followed her gaze toward the tree line. "Some did. Some will pretend. Some never will. But they will all remember what it felt like to be corrected, gently but unmistakably, by someone they thought was beneath them." Maggie nodded slowly. "Sometimes I wonder if that is enough." "It is more than most ever get," he replied. "And it plants something, even if they never admit it." Maggie sat on the bench, folding her hands in her lap. Her gaze was calm, thoughtful. "When I was growing up, I used to think wealth was power, that the ones with the money made all the rules. But then I met people who had everything and still felt small, still needed to make others feel smaller just to feel seen." Alexander sat beside her. "And what do you think now?" I think power is the ability to choose humility when pride is easier, to choose patience when anger burns, to choose kindness when cruelty is offered freely, and to never forget who you are, even when everyone else does. He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. You are the bravest person I know. The wind rustled the leaves gently, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called into the night. The next morning, Maggie arrived at the foundation early. She had a meeting with a group of youth counselors launching a mental health initiative, and then another meeting with representatives from a literacy organization. As she walked through the lobby, Daniel, the receptionist, looked up with a grin. "You made the paper," he said, holding up the morning edition. "Page 5. Quiet philanthropist sparks cultural shift in old money circles." Maggie took the paper with a quiet laugh. The headline meant nothing. The work meant everything. She set it aside and moved into the conference room where the counselors were waiting. Their ideas were fresh, rooted in experience, driven by compassion. Maggie listened intently, asked smart questions, took notes. She was not there to be impressive. She was there to understand, to empower. That was always the mission. A few days later, as she stepped out of the foundation and into the afternoon sun, she was surprised to see Aunt Clarissa waiting by the front steps. She wore her usual pearls, her bag stiff and designer, but her expression had softened. Maggie approached slowly. "Aunt Clarissa." Clarissa looked up, clearly rehearsing something in her mind. "Maggie, I was in the area. I thought I might stop by." Maggie offered a small nod. "Of course. Is there something I can help you with?" Clarissa hesitated, then reached into her bag and pulled out a letter. "It is from one of the local schools. They are trying to build a new arts wing. They reached out to me because I had mentioned family connections, and I thought, maybe this is something you could look at, or guide me on." There was a silence between them that felt like a thread being tied, cautious but real. Maggie took the letter, scanning it briefly. "I know this school. They do good work. I would be happy to help." Clarissa exhaled slowly, as if releasing years of built-up tension. "Thank you." She looked away, then added, almost too quietly to hear, "And I am sorry for the way I treated you." Maggie nodded. Apology accepted. There was no performance, no drawn-out sentiment, just a quiet recognition that something important had happened. Clarissa turned to leave, then paused. "You know," she said, "I used to think simplicity meant smallness. Now I think it might mean strength." Maggie watched her go, the letter still in her hand. She did not smile, but something in her shoulders eased. Some stories did not need fanfare. They just needed to be lived truthfully. That evening, Maggie sat in the den with a stack of papers on her lap and a classical record playing softly in the background. Alexander was on the other side of the room reading over a report, but his eyes often drifted to her. She looked peaceful, focused, entirely at home in a world that had once doubted she belonged. He finally set his folder down and crossed to the sofa, sitting beside her. "You always know exactly what needs your attention," he said gently. Maggie glanced up and smiled. "It is a gift, or a habit." He leaned back, watching her turn the page. "I got a call from the editor of the local business journal today. They want to feature you." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "Because apparently, humility paired with extraordinary results is newsworthy," Alexander replied. "They want to know what makes you tick." She set the papers aside and folded her hands. "And what did you tell them?" "I said no one can define you in 1,000 words, and if they tried, they would miss the point." Maggie chuckled softly, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Good answer." The next day brought another unexpected message. This time it was from a man named Gerald Morton, one of the most influential voices on the Collins Advisory Board and someone who had been vocal in the past about preserving tradition and protecting legacy wealth. His message was formal, but its tone was different than any Maggie had received from him before. He asked for a meeting, not to challenge, but to understand. Maggie agreed, choosing a neutral location at the foundation office rather than a private club or estate. She dressed the same as always, plain slacks, a cotton blouse, and flats. Gerald arrived in a tailored suit and polished shoes, carrying an air of old-school authority softened by curiosity. They exchanged brief greetings and then sat across from each other in the glass-walled conference room. "I appreciate your time," Gerald began. "I realize we have not spoken much in the past." Maggie nodded. "We move in different circles." He chuckled. "That may be an understatement." There was a pause. Then he said, "The truth is, I never paid attention to the work you have done with the foundation. I assumed it was a side project, something ornamental." Maggie said nothing, allowing the moment to settle. "But I read the reports. I looked into the numbers. You are responsible for more measurable impact than any five of us combined." His voice was not resentful. It was almost reverent. "I came here because I wanted to understand how you did it." Maggie leaned forward slightly. "By listening to people no one else listens to, and by remembering that success means nothing if it only serves the people already standing at the front of the line." Gerald looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Would you ever consider helping restructure the way we evaluate proposals within the trust?" It was not a question he would have asked 6 months ago. She knew that. She also knew it was not about flattery. It was about necessity. The family's future depended on evolving, and evolution required humility. "I would consider it," Maggie said simply, "but not alone. It needs to be a committee of voices, not just mine." Gerald nodded slowly. "Agreed." The meeting ended with a handshake and a look of mutual respect. When he left, Maggie sat alone for a moment, watching the sunlight filter through the windows. For years, she had been content to work in the margins, but now, without seeking it, the center had come to her. At home that night, she stood by the fireplace while Alexander read aloud a letter from a small rural clinic the foundation had recently supported. It was handwritten by a nurse named Caroline, thanking them for providing pediatric equipment they had never dreamed of affording. The letter ended with a photograph of a smiling child gripping the handles of a brand new wheelchair. Maggie looked at the photo for a long time, then said, "This is why we do it. Not the applause, not the headlines. Just this." Alexander nodded. "And the world is better because you never needed to be seen to make an impact." A week later, the Collins family hosted another event, this time a fundraising dinner for regional outreach. Maggie was, as usual, not listed as the headliner, but her name carried more weight now than any speaker on the program. She arrived early to check on the staff, spoke with the caterers, and helped a young intern realign the name cards on the donor tables. She wore a simple dark dress, nothing flashy, but the people who greeted her now did so with real warmth. When Aunt Clarissa arrived, she made a point of seeking Maggie out. Her tone had changed. She offered a compliment on the program's reach and asked genuine questions about upcoming initiatives. Maggie answered each one with the same sincerity she had always shown, but now there was no condescension shadowing their conversation. Midway through the evening, Laura stood up to speak. She shared the success of the job training program, now serving 3 neighborhoods with a wait list already forming. She credited the foundation, but she credited Maggie by name. The applause was genuine, and this time, Maggie allowed herself to stand and accept it. Not because she needed the recognition, but because others needed to see what quiet leadership looked like. When the dinner ended and the guests filtered out into the night, Maggie remained behind, helping staff fold linens and carry unused centerpieces back to the van. She found meaning in the details, in the work, in the people. At home, she and Alexander sat on the porch in silence, each lost in thought. Finally, Maggie said, "You know, I do not think I was ever humiliated at that reunion." "Not really." Alexander turned to her, eyebrows raised. "No?" She shook her head. "What they tried to do was humiliate me, but they failed, because humiliation only sticks when you believe it yourself, and I never did." Alexander smiled. "That is the difference between you and them. You know who you are. You do not need anyone else to remind you." 1 month later, the Collins Foundation hosted its annual gala at the historic Grand Oak Hall downtown. The marble steps gleamed under the light of chandeliers, and the wide double doors stood open to welcome guests from all corners of the city. It was the most anticipated event of the year, attended by politicians, philanthropists, business leaders, and family alike. Maggie arrived early, dressed in a midnight blue gown that flowed softly as she moved. She had not chosen it to impress, but to honor the event's purpose and the people it served. The staff greeted her warmly, volunteers already bustling around the ballroom finalizing details. She spent the first hour checking in on table arrangements, making sure accessibility needs were addressed, and offering a steady presence for the team that had spent months preparing for this night. By the time guests began to arrive, the hall was alive with energy. Laughter echoed off the high ceilings, camera shutters clicked softly, and waiters carried silver trays of hors d'oeuvres through the mingling crowd. Maggie stood near the entrance with Alexander, who looked every bit the composed host, but his hand resting lightly at the small of her back betrayed the depth of his affection. People approached in waves. Some came to thank her. Some came to ask advice. Some came just to be near the woman whose name had slowly become synonymous with impact and grace. And Maggie treated each interaction with the same patience, the same warmth, as if they were old friends catching up rather than admirers seeking proximity to influence. Halfway through the evening, as the dinner portion began and guests took their seats beneath strings of golden lights, a quiet signal was given for the evening's main presentation to begin. A short video played first, showing highlights from the Foundation's past year, children in classrooms receiving laptops, wheelchair basketball teams in brand new gyms, job centers bustling with activity and promise. The room fell silent as those images spoke louder than any speech ever could. Then the lights brightened, and the host introduced Maggie with a voice filled with admiration. She walked onto the stage without notes, without pretense, and stood before the audience with the ease of someone who was not performing but simply sharing what mattered. She began with a story about a girl named Lila, who had once been too shy to speak in school, but now read to younger students every day thanks to a program funded by the people in this room. She spoke not of herself, but of outcomes, of voices that had been lifted, of dignity restored, of doors opened through collective effort. Her voice was steady, quiet at times, but it drew people in, made them feel seen, made them believe they could be part of something that mattered. She ended not with a plea, but with a challenge. We all walk into rooms where we are judged before we speak. We all encounter people who see only the surface. But if you have ever been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed, then you know something powerful. You know how to see others. You know how to make space. And that is how change begins. The applause rose slowly, then filled the room, echoing with more than approval. It was acknowledgement. As Maggie stepped down from the stage, she saw faces shining with emotion. Some were familiar, others were not. But they were connected now, through something deeper than wealth or status, through purpose. Clarissa, seated at the front table, stood and clapped with real conviction. Laura wiped her eyes. Gerald nodded once, solemnly. Alexander met her halfway across the ballroom and offered his hand. She took it, and together they returned to their table, not as royalty among donors, but as builders among equals. The rest of the evening passed in a golden blur. Guests lingered long past the scheduled end time, unwilling to let go of the warmth that had filled the room. Later that night, after the last car had driven away and the lights had dimmed, Maggie and Alexander walked alone through the empty hall. The tables were cleared, the flowers slightly wilted, and the echoes of laughter and clapping had faded into soft stillness. "You changed something tonight," Alexander said as they moved past the stage. "Not just here, in them." Maggie looked up at him, then around the grand room. Maybe I just reminded them of something they already knew and forgot. Outside, the air was crisp and clean, the sky wide above them as they stepped down the marble stairs hand in hand. The following week brought new proposals, new outreach letters, new faces seeking guidance or mentorship. Maggie handled each one with the same deliberate calm. She did not rush. She did not boast. She simply continued. One afternoon, while reviewing applications for a new health grant, she received a package with no return address. Inside was a single envelope and a photo. The photo showed a girl, maybe 16, standing in front of a small house with peeling paint, holding a sign that read, "Thank you for seeing me." The letter was short. "I was at the gala. I listened. I thought you should know you helped someone find their voice. I have never donated before. I will now." Maggie folded the letter gently and placed it in a drawer beside her desk. Not for display, not for sharing, just for remembering. As the seasons changed and the work continued, the memory of that family reunion lingered not as a wound, but as a turning point. It had revealed more than just cruelty or arrogance. It had revealed strength, quiet and unshakable. It had shown what it meant to hold dignity even when none was offered, what it meant to lead without demanding applause, to give without asking for recognition, and to forgive without forgetting. Maggie never brought it up again. She never needed to. Those who had been there remembered, and those who came after learned quickly how the family had changed and why. Years from now, when the Collins Foundation expanded internationally and stories of its impact were told in classrooms, boardrooms, and communities around the world, few would remember the day Maggie Collins was laughed at beneath a white canopy by people who thought she did not belong. But the ones who mattered would remember what came after. They would remember that the woman in the simple dress held the future in her hands and never once let it be shaped by pride. She chose kindness. She chose clarity. She chose to rise not above, but through. And that made all the difference. The next generation of the Collins family grew up differently. They still played on manicured lawns and attended excellent schools, but they were taught to measure success by impact, not inheritance. At gatherings, it became normal to hear cousins discussing volunteer hours alongside test scores, to see elders listening instead of lecturing, to watch a new kind of pride take shape, one rooted in service, not spectacle. Maggie remained central, not because she insisted on it, but because people naturally gravitated toward her. She became the one they asked for guidance, for clarity, for truth when polite lies no longer sufficed. And she offered it freely, not with judgment, but with conviction. Clarissa eventually became a patron of the arts program she once dismissed. Gerald stepped down from the advisory board to make room for younger, more diverse voices, and credited Maggie with changing the way he understood leadership. Laura's job center grew into a network, serving thousands, and she spoke often of the coffee shop meeting that changed her entire trajectory. None of them pretended the past had not happened. They simply worked harder not to repeat it. Maggie continued her work in the same quiet way. She visited new programs without announcing herself, spoke to children without cameras following her, and redirected praise to the teams that executed the vision. She rarely appeared in publications unless it was absolutely necessary. When she did, she insisted the spotlight also include the people actually doing the work. She never sought awards, but the ones she received, she placed in the community center lobby where the recipients of her efforts could see what their stories had built. Alexander, ever steady at her side, continued to manage the financial architecture that sustained their reach. He often told people that Maggie was the foundation's soul, while he was just the scaffolding. The board meetings changed too. More women joined. More staff were elevated into decision-making roles. Budgets were not only reviewed, but challenged with ethical questions. The language shifted from metrics alone to meaning, from efficiency to empathy. And Maggie, always with her pen and notebook, always prepared, led with a kind of strength that silenced rooms, not with power, but with presence. One spring, the foundation celebrated its 20th anniversary. Instead of a gala, Maggie proposed a community celebration across multiple neighborhoods. No red carpet, no headlines, just food trucks, music, and open doors at every site the foundation had touched. Alexander stood beside her that day, watching as hundreds of families poured into the parks and streets, their faces lit with joy. He turned to her and said, "This is your legacy." But Maggie shook her head and replied, "No, this is our future." That evening, after the final volunteers had packed the last chairs into vans and the parks had gone quiet, Maggie sat on a folding bench near the basketball court. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. She was tired, but it was the good kind of tired, the kind that came from having given something everything it deserved. A little girl with curly hair ran up to her and climbed onto the bench without hesitation. She handed Maggie a drawing made with crayons. It showed a woman in a long blue dress, standing in front of a house with hearts floating all around. Maggie smiled and asked, "Is this your mom?" The girl shook her head. "No, it is you. My mom said you made our house warm again." Maggie looked down at the drawing, her heart quiet and full. She folded it gently, promising to keep it safe. When the girl ran off to join the others, Maggie remained seated, holding the drawing like something sacred. It reminded her that influence was not something you claimed. It was something you carried, carefully, honestly, and always for the benefit of others. Years later, after Maggie had stepped back from day-to-day operations and passed the torch to new leaders she had mentored for years, she and Alexander returned to the place where it all began. The Collins family estate, now used as a training center for young advocates, was hosting a retreat for scholarship recipients. Maggie arrived without announcement, walking quietly through the halls filled with the voices of young people discussing justice, equality, and opportunity. No one rushed to greet her, not out of disrespect, but because the culture she built did not center hierarchy. A young woman named Layla approached her in the library. She was 19, studying to become a civil rights attorney, and had been part of the foundation's youth mentorship program. She recognized Maggie only from photos. "Are you Maggie Collins?" she asked. Maggie smiled and nodded. "I have wanted to meet you," Layla said. "I wanted to say thank you. You changed everything." Maggie replied softly, "I did not do it alone, and neither will you." Layla sat beside her, and they talked about plans, fears, and dreams for nearly an hour. When Layla left to join her workshop, Maggie walked through the quiet hallway, her footsteps echoing off the stone floors. She paused at a display in the foyer, photos from the foundation's history, letters from recipients, maps of expansion. In the center was a small plaque that read, "This place exists because one woman chose kindness over recognition, humility over revenge, and dignity over ego. She was not loud, but she was heard." Maggie stood in front of that plaque for a moment longer, then turned and stepped outside into the early evening light. The air smelled of rain and new beginnings. Somewhere nearby, children were laughing, chasing each other between the trees. It was a sound she never grew tired of. Alexander waited for her near the car, reading a newspaper with a coffee in hand. He looked up when she approached. "Ready to go?" She nodded, and as they drove away, the wind gently rustling through the open window, she glanced back one last time. Not out of nostalgia, but out of deep and abiding peace. She had been underestimated, dismissed, and judged. But she never lost herself. And in the end, she did not need revenge, because she had built something better than retribution. She had built respect, she had planted understanding, and she had become unforgettable, not because she demanded to be, but because she never needed to.